Long Branch City Hall. What a great venue for a book about an explosion. Just think of all the blasts that have occurred here. Well, they were political, fiscal, legal, regulatory, but this is about a real physical explosion that harmed real people. Now the book, Explosion at Morgan, is not a thriller with a surprise or dramatic buildup. Immediately, the first paragraph tells you that at 7:40 p.m. on Friday, October 4th, 1918, there began a series of explosions and fires which originated through a workers' error that devastated the T.A. Gillespie shell loading plant. What was worse, the blast raised fears that if the spreading fire reached a critical storage area, there would follow a massive explosion, a blast so powerful that it could have destroyed a vast surrounding area. So at this presentation, be confident that the book will tell you about the unfolding drama, the acts of heroism, and the valiant efforts to contain the region's deadliest disaster. But tonight, I will tell you the background of the event, discuss other domestic destruction during the war, and place the Gillespie plant along with the munitions industry in the context of World War I. I'll also mention why the disaster has been forgotten by history. First, let's look at the locale of the Gillespie plant explosion and the man Gillespie. Morgan is the easternmost section of the borough of Sayreville, a locale easily overlooked within that sprawling municipality, as the Morgan neighborhood is not only adjacent to South Amboy, but is often operated in the economic and social sphere of the latter city. The Morgan area, with colonial-era origins from the extensive holdings of the Morgan family, appears to have been given that name when the New York and Long Branch Railroad, today's New Jersey Transit North Jersey coastline, opened a small station there in 1875. They named that station on the northern edge of Chesapeake Creek, Morgan. The stop was built as much to serve the staff for their adjacent drawbridge as for any then existing revenue traffic. The engineer, Thomas Andrew Gillespie, hailed from Pittsburgh, where he built a significant contracting business, one that specialized in water infrastructure projects and transportation. The Gillespie firm also had early munitions experience, stemming from a relatively small shell loading plant they built in 1915, located in the Parlin section of Sayreville. Gillespie then supplied shells for Russia and Great Britain. Their experience would prove invaluable. After America entered the war in 1917, Gillespie, as one of the few experienced hands in the United States, was chosen to build a large munitions assembly plant, a fast-track project in which he acted as an agent of the federal government. Now, one may ask, what exactly is shell loading? It is the process of assembling materials for artillery shells, which includes the empty shell, the propellant, typically black powder, which sends the shell racing to its target, the explosive material, the weapon that will be discharged, often shrapnel, or in World War I, even poison gas. These components were enclosed under a cap with a visible head of the shell. Now at that time, a war was going on. The conflict, initially known as the Great War, broke out in August 1914 across a Europe where some nations were still seething from recent lesser clashes, such as the Balkan Wars. The June 14th assassination of Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand became the spark that ignited a continent, set into motion mutual defense pacts, agreements that had often been signed in secret. As nations mobilized, they feared that smaller grievances were escalating into major conflicts. However, they followed their codes of honor that mandated the fulfillment of commitments, even when better judgment made them reluctant to unleash militaries that had built massive destructive force. Some nations sent their armies to the front with the realization that they were making a mistake. At home, the time was waning when America could regard its ocean borders as a shield against foreign wars. Accordingly, the country promptly declared its neutrality. And neutrality is a status governed by international law. It requires unbiased treatment of belligerents, including the matter of arms dealings. For practical purposes, the United States would have willingly sold arms to any combatant, but the state of affairs of the world's waters determined with whom we could do business. Great Britain's naval superiority gave them undisputed controls of the sea, which prompted Germany to send many of its finest merchant and passenger ships to United States ports, where they could wait out the war in safety rather than risk destruction by the British on the open seas. This scenario would even impact the conflict in New Jersey prior to our April 1917 entry into the war. Some of these intern German ships, many of which were tied up at Hoboken piers, would play a role in Germany's campaign of domestic destruction. But on the sanguine side, these same ships would be taken over by America and used to transport troops after we entered the war. Now, looking at the financial angle, war has long created the opportunity to make great fortunes, which American industrialists had realized at least since the Civil War, a thought foremost in the mind of Bethlehem Steel Company President Charles Schwab. As soon as the war broke out, he became a major supplier to Great Britain, at times in ways that compromised this country's neutrality. Britannia ruled the waves and established an effective naval blockade of German ports. So United States neutrality was decidedly one-sided. Germany struck back. They utilized one means available to combat America's supply of its enemy: sabotage, or terrorism in today's parlance. Let's take a look at their nefarious actions, especially events that relate to the Morgan disaster. German operatives infiltrated American industry, then undertook a campaign to destroy whatever they could of America's war-aiding capabilities, including our food supplies. Explosions and incendiary fires were numerous, but their most clever act was a ruse. German agents constructed a munitions plant in Bridgeport, Connecticut, for the purpose of denying material to their enemy. The plant purchased powder, which it subsequently destroyed. In addition, this German-built factory ordered munitions-making machinery, for which it had no intention of taking delivery. However, the process would deny this machinery to their enemy. Their most insidious operation was carried out locally: the manufacture of small, time-delayed incendiary bombs, which were placed in the holds of Allied shipping. Since the bombs could not have been made in a factory without detection, they were actually assembled in the machine shop of a German ocean liner that was laid up in Hoboken and slipped inside the holds of ships by disaffected German seamen. These devices, called cigar bombs, caused a number of fires at sea, but the fires were extinguished and the resultant damage was relatively minor. Their most destructive actions were the blowing up of munitions facilities, most notably the storage transportation dock at Black Tom, which was located in the southern section of Jersey City, across the Hudson River from the New York Financial District. There, a massive explosion on July 30th, 1916, literally brought the war to the business and communications nerve center of the country. Fatalities numbered only about 7, but property damage was extensive, and the area's collective nerves were on edge. Many still confuse the Black Tom explosion with Morgan, while the two are linked in my mind for personal reasons. I was born and raised in proximity to Black Tom, while I have lived most of my adult life about 10 miles from the Gillespie plant. My motivation for this book was prompted by long-standing curiosity why Black Tom was fixed in memory while the Gillespie blast was forgotten. I expect that the explosion at Morgan will give the latter disaster its historical due. But there was more. On January 11th, 1917, 6 months after Black Tom, a plant in the Meadowlands at Kingsland, near Lyndhurst, was totally destroyed by saboteurs. The absence and death of this loading plant owned by the Canadian Car Company may make it more understandable for history to have forgotten the Kingsland explosion. My book enumerates still more sabotage, including the burning of food, even cattle at a Hudson County dock. The subject of sabotage is so vast that it could fill volumes. The effort after the war to prove sabotage at Black Tom is a gripping detective story, one that has made a fine book. Everything changed once the United States entered the war that President Wilson's public protestations claimed that he so ardently sought to avoid. Indeed, the foundation of his 1916 re-election campaign was his having kept us out of the war, this war that American industry was financing, this conflict where it appeared that our involvement was inevitable. This subject, which has been argued and analyzed for nearly 100 years, is briefly hinted at in this book. For the most part, sabotage ended with the American entry for the simple reason that sabotage during war is a capital offense. Then, sabotage during peacetime was not even a specific crime. Arsonists and other enemy troublemakers may have been willing to risk lengthy prison terms, but placing their necks on the line was a different matter. The United States was virtually disarmed in 1914. Our standing army was tiny. In addition, evolving action on the battlefield made nearly all of our tactics and weapons obsolete. The long spell of our watchful waiting provided the opportunity to build and modernize our military. But we let it slip by and were hardly better prepared in April 1917. Then, President Wilson, a month after his second inauguration, asked Congress to declare war against the Central Powers. At that time, the truly clueless did not even think we would need to raise a wartime army. The early years of the war demonstrated the lethal effect of machine guns and modern artillery. We had few of either and hardly any aircraft. The United States' large population, wealth, and industrial capacity possessed the capability to remedy these shortcomings. But early efforts to build a munitions industry began with fits and starts. It was ineffective. This country spent enormous sums to build big guns and military planes, but not very well. When American forces arrived in France, they fired French guns and flew British aircraft. After the war, the Army congratulated itself on the role munitions played in winning the war, but the role was at best compromised. However, our munitions industry did excel in two crucial areas. The first was the supply of raw materials, including the chemicals needed for artillery shells. The second, to get to the heart of this book, was the rapid construction of shell-loading plants. Now, prior to the war, the military maintained its own capacity to load shells. The Army and Navy each maintained arsenals. The Army here in New Jersey at Picatinny, to produce the limited quantities needed in peacetime. However, the enormous output needed during war, especially in a war when artillery became the principal weapon, required new plants that could be built rapidly by and operated by private firms. 4 massive plants were constructed in New Jersey. Each utilized the skills of the few experienced shell-loading personnel. One such key expert was Joseph D. Evans. He built a plant in Sayreville that is even more obscure than Gillespie's, and was the manufacturing expert behind a southern New Jersey plant. Arms super supplier Bethlehem Steel also built a South Jersey plant, while Gillespie built the subject plant at Morgan. DuPont, which had an enormous role as the country's largest manufacturer of smokeless powder, the propellant for shells, also built a similar shell loading facility in Penniman, Virginia. These firms operated under contracts for cost plus 10% profit. Their rapid progress permitted production to begin by mid-1918. The buildings of these plants were of temporary construction, which speeded their progress and controlled costs. The latter an important consideration, as there would be no use for these buildings after the war. The Gillespie plant became a significant producer during its abbreviated existence. However, I must correct a popular misapprehension about Gillespie's production. The war's enormous output of artillery shells and the brief existence of the Morgan plant made its total output the mere equivalent of a few days' supply during a major offensive. Let's take a look at how America participated in the war in order to understand the larger picture of war production. The Entente, referred to in America as the Allies after our entry, suffered enormous casualties in fields for small pieces of ground. I recall my brief elementary school instruction on the war, briefly summarized by the claim that an all-powerful America rescued our allies by wiping out the enemy. Then, after the peace was established, a heroic President Wilson ardently fought for American participation in the League of Nations, but was thwarted by an uncooperative Senate led by his nemesis, Henry Cabot Lodge. Not so at all. This summary is patently false. Our fighting force was built virtually from scratch. After we arrived in France, the American Army incurred long delays, first to assemble adequate numbers and then for training, prior to attaining combat capability. General John J. Pershing insisted on maintaining American soldiers as separate fighting units rather than using them as piecemeal replacements in a war of attrition. Then, not only were they late to the battlefield, but American tactics were quickly demonstrated as inadequate. Evolving warfare had simply made them obsolete. Learning these lessons came at the cost of excessive casualties. Only after this country adjusted its tactics and weapons did the American forces contribute significantly with several key victories. A still powerful German army countered with a major offensive in the spring of 1918, but their offensive failed as much from poor tactical decisions as from lack of battlefield capability. Actually, the greatest drain on both the German military and their civilians resulted from the effectiveness of the British naval blockade. They were literally starving to death. When the war was finally ended in November, its timing was delayed to placate peacemakers who sought an armistice precisely timed for the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Needless casualties were suffered because of aggressive commanders who refused to believe that the war was over and attacked that morning. Their actions comprise a cruel footnote to the American role. After the war's end, President Wilson campaigned tirelessly to advance his 14 points, principles of international behavior that he hoped would assure lasting peace and help establish a new world order. He was an ardent supporter of American participation in the League of Nations. He clashed with both allies abroad who were eager for reparation and retribution, and senators at home who were wary of the surrender of American authority. Wilson was plagued by his inflexible personality, his intolerance for anyone who disagreed with him, and an inability to compromise. The defeat of his ideals was, for the most part, the product of his own intransigence. Consequently, the world would erupt in an even greater war a mere 2 decades later. At Morgan, the facility storage section survived, largely intact. Demobilization would turn this section into a massive warehousing and distribution center. Local residents remained uncomfortable in the post-war era, as they were forced to cope with the presence of large numbers of soldiers, while they remained fearful of more explosions from stored weapons. In time, the storage operations ended, and 10 years later, the area was primed for development. Unfortunately, timing was poor, as an ample supply of building lots existed nearby, and the ensuing Great Depression collapsed the local real estate market. Most of the plan declined into a state of an abandoned wasteland. It so remained for decades until post-World War II development needs prompted builders to clear the land and build on it. Before wrapping up, I'll make a few points on the accident and the damage. Could the plant fire crew have extinguished the first blaze? Possibly. An inadequate water distribution system was compromised by the initial explosion, so the brave fire crews who responded immediately to the first blast did not have the water supply to put it out. Would automatic sprinklers have helped? Probably. Bear in mind that the plant was built on the cheap. Expediency and low cost were paramount. Actually, the buildings were not in compliance with New Jersey code. The government's response after damage claims were submitted was essentially to shrug off the matter with the assertion that the federal government was not subject to state regulation. Why were the later explosions so fierce? The authorities did not know what they were getting into with respect to the materials on hand, especially with the large quantities stored and how they would react in the event of accident. For example, the volatile qualities of ammonium nitrate were simply not known. It was the explosion of that chemical that caused the largest blasts in the deepest craters. Safety standards and prevention principles are typically drawn from accidents and disasters, including simple things we take for granted, such as doors that open outward, fire curtains in theaters, and sprinklers in virtually all public buildings. A fire insurance engineer was almost prophetic in the early years of the war when he wrote that the handling of shell-making materials in such great quantities in buildings without high protection standards created a scenario that could not then be adequately evaluated. Was sabotage the cause of the explosion? Almost certainly not. Gillespie was aware virtually immediately what caused the blast: worker error, a belief that was confirmed after a government investigation. One reasons, however, that if conspiracy theorists were around in 1918 as they are today, they would still be talking about the mystery saboteur. In conclusion, why was the Morgan explosion forgotten by history? Firstly, timing. The war ended only 5 weeks after the disaster. At the time, the nation was eager to return to a normal existence. Indeed, a return to normalcy was the foundation of the successful presidential election campaign of Warren Harding in 1920. Secondly, the temporary munitions plants had such a short existence that they were never fixed in the public consciousness. Even the locations which were not destroyed did not long endure. Thirdly, we remember war heroes, but hardly give a thought to those who furnished their arms. However, the vital role of munitions workers deserves remembrance. Their sacrifices were real. I end by quoting the words that conclude the book. They were in the mind of a newspaper editor who, during a campaign for a fitting memorial 10 years after the disaster, imagined what the spirit of one of the casualties might say on that occasion. We did not fight in France, but were killed in action, just as frightfully and just as bravely, but we have not died in vain. Yes, Joe.
Randy, I used to go to a place in Oregon called Club Benet.
Ah, yes.
You know, is it in that proximity where it was?
Yes. That was the eastern edge of the plant, Highway 35. It extended somewhat north of that. It extended south on the other side of Cheesequake Creek, and for some distance to the west. It was about 2,200 acres.
Oh.
Now, that's a settled area, so one issue that should really be in question was why such a plant with the volatile characteristics that it had built so close to a populated area or a settled area. And that's a legitimate issue. A local real estate person wanted to sell that to the government. And he was quite proud of his accomplishment in pre-explosion of publicity, but after the war, in his vanity biography in the history of Middlesex County, he didn't mention it. On the other hand, it's not that he wasn't sharing the risk. He lived right next to the plant, and that's the end of his house. He moved to Middletown after that, by the way. Yes?
Being right on the creek, on Cheesequake Creek, gave them easy access to move barges in and out from that loading plant out to lighters and then out to freighters.
That's right. It was not only easy access, but it was essential access, because after the Black Tom explosion, there was a big issue in the New York, New Jersey area, the harbor area, about putting explosives so close to a heavily built up area. So they had a loading zone, which you can actually see on some maps in proximity to Sandy Hook. And while the raw materials came into the plant by railroad, the finished shell were shipped out on that creek on barges and lighters, and then offloaded onto munitions ships closer to Sandy Hook.
Was Earl Ammunition Depot there at that time?
No. Earl was built in 1943, 1944. Now, one of the things that comes up is recollection of other explosions. And perhaps you're thinking of the explosion that Earl suffered in 1947. Earl got through the war without a fatality, but then some munitions on a destroyer escort blew up that year and killed about 7 people. So in the book, I recount other explosions, especially the other one in proximity to Morgan, which was the powder pier explosion in South Amboy in 1950. That was another handling accident, and anyone in proximity to that was just incinerated, blown to bits.
2 questions. Are there any markers that, you know?
No, but I've suggested one, and maybe that will happen. There should be a marker, and the Middlesex County Cultural and Heritage Commission was receptive to it for a time, but I think it will have to come from a local source. Maybe it will take a little more prodding.
You had also mentioned an employee error was involved, and I don't recall hearing what that.
The employee era was not cooling down with water an overheated mix of chemicals. He didn't want to ruin the batch. So consequently, he ruined the plan, or at least that reluctance to take action ruined the plan. Also related to that, which I hinted at in the talk and explained a little more deeply in the book, was the water delivery system. The explosion cut off the delivery of water, and there were better ways of designing a system so that if you had a breach at one point, you could still get delivery elsewhere. So they didn't have water to fight the fire. So the worst blasts were the subsequent ones, including the blast that made a crater 30 feet deep. That's illustrated in the book.
Yeah, I'm just surprised how, I mean, this created a lot of concern for safety, but yet 30 years later, around South Amboy, there were still munitions shipping going on. Wasn't there people from the area and local politicians trying to fight this?
After the war, they were, after the powder beer explosion, they were quite adamant about it. But before, no, that pier had been in operation for quite some time. And the South Amboy elected officials made mighty protests saying they had done more than their share. And it's true.
Having grown up in that area, the 1950 explosion was the shipment of arms to the Middle East.
That's right.
Never knew whether they were shipping them to the Israelis or the Arabs, just that they were going out. And I don't think that the people in South Amboy, my wife and I and my friends here, we didn't know that was going on.
I believe they were going to Pakistan and Afghanistan. I mentioned it in the book. There were 500 words on the explosion. And there were also some others that were even worse. The Port Chicago disaster in California. And that too was largely forgotten by history. It came up a number of years ago because there sailors were punished for a mutiny.
Randall, you mentioned that there was some talk locally after the explosion. Was there any litigation or anything that changed what happened in that area as a result of the explosion?
Well, they tend to locate plants or explosives handling operations in less settled areas. But stuff still blows up. I mean, if you want to keep track of all what happens, you can get plenty of articles on this. I mean, it's still happening. Here, this was in the Times on the 20th. 7 Marines were killed in a Nevada training accident. Now, I don't know whether this was a mistake, the gun or the explosives, but it happens all the time, and stuff gets buried. And it doesn't have to be weapons. Here's one from February. Fireworks truck explodes, shattering a bridge in China. And then there were other accidents at the time. Here's a little news item for that other plant, one that's even less known. Percussion caps at a nearby plant sort of reminded me, those of us who are old enough to remember when you could get access to construction sites and things weren't too well guarded. You know, remember what we were told? Well, dynamite sticks won't blow up, but a blasting cap will.
Yeah, what started the fire in the Normandy ship when it was anchored here in New York City? The Normandy.
The Normandy?
Yeah, that burned up. You know what started that? It would have been a great ship for because friends of mine had come back from Europe and Red Bank, boats for recovery while they get coming to the hospitals here. I just went to Normandy, was sitting there in a great ship, and I don't know what it was destroyed by fire. Do you know anything why it happened?
Now, where did this happen?
New York City.
In New York City.
Yeah, the Normandy would come here and after.
Oh, the Normandy, that was an ocean liner.
Yeah.
Yeah, that had a fire on board, and it capsized from the water that was put in there to put it out.
It started from a workman's torch on the inside, because they were redoing it into a troop transport from a luxury liner. So they said that the guy dropped an acetylene torch and that started the fire.
People don't realize that when buildings are being worked on, not only repairs or alterations or even new construction, that can be the most dangerous time of their existence. That's how the Monmouth County Park System lost the mansion at the park headquarters. And even when a new building, a so-called fireproof building is going up, there's all sorts of combustible materials on the site. Very dangerous time.
The Kingsland explosion, there's a smokestack that still stands in Lyndhurst from the original plant in the swamps there. Is there any physical remnant, artifact from the Morgan plant that's still there?
Yes. There are a couple of buildings, and there is a wall from the power building in the Morgan Marina. I have a picture of that in the book, but extremely little. If you go in some of the fields around Shrewsbury Creek, maybe you'll find some underground storage magazines, but that doesn't count.
One other quick question. Most of the fatalities, were they resultant from the subsequent explosions as opposed to the original?
It's really hard to say. It was said that most of those in the building, the first building that went up, 611, they were identified by building numbers, were killed. Some got out of there, but also you would read accounts of people dying as they were trying to flee. There was someone recounted to a reporter how he was talking with someone, and this was supposedly at some distance away, and a shell came flying and decapitated the guy he was talking to, and the person recounting the story was unharmed. There was another story, this is unconfirmed, I don't know how true it was. Someone was in his automobile some distance away watching, and he was killed. One of the problems of getting an accurate full report was the area was so dangerous, people were kept away, that no one really had a comprehensive view of the total site. So you would get bits and pieces of eyewitnesses who would report what they saw, but there was no helicopter overhead giving you real-time pictures as the disaster evolved. Much of the story of the actual blast was taken from newspaper accounts, and they tended to get kind of repetitive.
So the initial explosion happened in a mixing facility. Now, did that go from one mixing facility to another, or did it get into the storage areas?
It got into an adjoining building. Now, I don't recall whether the adjoining building was a mixing building or a storage building. Each building had a function, but it spread from building to building to building.
Because in the plant down south, the storage buildings were well separated from the actual mixing and loading.
They were separated, but it comes down to a question of how do you define well. They thought they were well separated, but obviously they weren't separated.
They had no blast berms in place between buildings?
Apparently not. I've never seen a picture, but interestingly enough, in one of the plants in South Jersey, they had considerable plastic
Amatoll
berms. Yeah, the one at the Amatoll plant.
Has that whole area been redeveloped now?
Yes, with the exception of the area around Cheesequake Creek. You can go on to Ground Zero, and there's a very nice suburban development, one of the finest sections of Sayreville, and I would imagine that at least half the residents have no idea what went on there not all that long ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
About your World War I critique, reparations was a big factor in people said for World War II. Now, there's a little known story about John Maynard Keynes, the economist. You've heard of him? He was in the reparations committee. He was preaching. He said, don't hit him too hard. It will just ruin everything. Come World War II, Germany's getting ready to invade England. And he's a homosexual, prime example for Holocaust. They sent out a safe conduct pass when they invaded England.
Well, if you look at the post-war conditions from the standpoint of the German people, I mean, they were starving, and then they were being squeezed. They were forced to pay these enormous reparations, but their industrial equipment was carted off. How could they do it? You can understand the resentment that Hitler found relatively easy to exploit.
How long did it take him to build the Morgan plant from the time that it was started till they started producing shells?
Oh, about 6 months.
Oh, because the Amatoll was 9 months.
They started in January, and it was ready for production around June or July, and they had a little setback. They had a fire, but it was pretty quickly. The whole plant wasn't finished, but the units came on one by one.
So the total production period was how long until it blew up?
From July to October 4th.
So it was a very short-lived plant.
Now, I don't mention the misapprehension by numbers in the book. I will here because I don't suppose it's going to be written down and repeated. But one of the problems with correcting a historical error is that you mention the error, you mention the correction, and then what do people remember? They remember the error.
Yeah, right.
So somehow it got into print that the Morgan plant produced 10% of all of the artillery shells used in World War I. And it's utter nonsense. And they had production records of the number of shells, so you look at the number, you look at what the British were firing in a major offensive, and then I come to my conclusion, it's a few days supply. But that number, 10%, gets repeated over and over again. Now, while I used newspapers of the time, when it was happening, stories that get reported later tend to be erroneous. Some of it is nonsense, and there are articles every now and then on certain anniversaries, and there'll probably be another one with the 100th year of World War I. But reportage on history in the contemporary past is not to be relied on.
What range of munitions was made there?
What range?
Yeah.
Let's see, they had 6-inch shells, I believe, was the big one, but they had different size shells. Shells for the French 155 millimeter gun, which is pictured in here. That was the principal weapon of the nation that was considered the prime artillerist of the world.
They didn't do any 8-inch shells. Didn't do any grenades or anything?
I don't think at this plant. No, not at this plant, but I believe at the Oliver plant nearby they produce grenades.
And Amatoll produced everything from hand grenades up through 8-inch shells and bombs. So it was, and they're credited with 25% of the production. So
I would suspect that's a rumor. And another source I used was government reports on war production. And I think Amitol had some problems in getting some of their lines started, and they didn't produce everything that they had made plans to produce.
now you mentioned that Schwab was involved with this plant. He also was involved with Amitol. Is he involved with other munition plants?
The Bethlehem Steel was a prime munitions manufacturer. The World War I really shot up the value of Bethlehem Steel considerably. And the comment about compromising the neutrality, there was a law passed that forbade the delivery of certain weapons, including submarines, from the United States to Great Britain. So what he did was send the parts to a Canadian subsidiary that were assembled there. He did not make himself too popular with the government by that stunt.
I know some of the newspaper accounts for Black Tom explosion talk about windows rattling in Philadelphia, really almost exaggerated, hard to believe. But how do the three explosions actually compare to the physical blast released?
Kind of hard to say because they were in different environments. And the distant shattering of a window might be a curiosity, but glass was all over the streets of New York and Jersey City.
In the case of South Amboy, one can appreciate the force of the explosion when you consider that the explosives, consisting of some TNT and dynamite, were already loaded on board a lighter which was going to take it out to the main vessel. Well, it was not yet loaded. However, it was 2 boxcar loads of anti-personnel mines. When the explosion took place on the lighter, fortunately, some of the force of the explosion could go downward into the water. The explosion caused muddy water from the bottom of that portion of the bay to rain over a 3-mile radius around the South Amboy, around South Amboy. Curiously, a large anchor from the lighter was blasted through the air, traveled again 3 miles across the Raritan River, down into the heart of Perth Amboy, and embedded itself into the pavement, the sidewalk, in front of a movie theater. It was a considerable blast. Another strange event was that the showering of the anti-personnel mines, when perhaps an area half a mile in diameter, which included the trash disposal areas and so forth that run up to the Raritan Bridge. For some years afterwards, the Army units from what was then called the Raritan Arsenal would be called periodically. The bomb squad would come out and recover one of these mines. Fortunately, they were not armed; they were packaged and so forth. So those are some of the curious things about to describe the force of that explosion.
I wasn't aware of the rain or the anchor that landed in downtown Perth Amboy. Most of the information for the 500 words on the explosion came from the very fine report issued by the New York Board of Fire Underwriters. Have you seen that? It's a reasonably accessible publication. I brought some books for sale. They're $20 plus a dollar tax. I'll be over here and I'll be pleased to autograph them for you.
Thank you.